September 2nd, 1945. Omori Prison Camp, Tokyo Bay. The rice bowl was still trembling in her hands when Corporal Fumiko Nakamura heard the gates opening. Through the wooden slats of the barracks, she watched American soldiers enter the compound, their boots heavy on the gravel path. Everything the imperial propaganda had told her about these men was about to be tested. For 3 years, Japanese military nurses and civilian women captured across the Pacific had been told the same story. If the Americans ever took them prisoner, death would be a mercy compared to what would follow. Now, in the ruins of a defeated empire, hundreds of Japanese women held captive by their own military awaited their fate as the victors walked through the gates. What happened next would challenge everything both sides believed about war, honor, and humanity itself.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
The woman watching through the barrack slats that morning was 24 years old, a former Imperial Army nurse who had served in field hospitals across Manchuria and the Philippines. She had treated wounded soldiers, witnessed atrocities on both sides, and survived 3 years of imprisonment by her own government after being accused of defeatism for suggesting Japan might lose the war. Omori Camp had not been built for prisoners of war in the traditional sense. It housed Japanese civilians deemed dangerous to the war effort. Pacifists, suspected spies, political dissidents, and military personnel who had questioned orders or shown weakness. Among them were 347 women, many of them former nurses, teachers, and factory workers who had committed the unforgivable sin of doubt. They had watched American B-29s fly overhead for months, dropping incendiary bombs that turned Tokyo into an inferno. They had felt the ground shake when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They had heard Emperor Hirohito's voice on the radio, speaking for the first time in history to announce Japan's surrender. And they had waited, knowing that the Americans would come. The propaganda had been relentless and specific. Posters throughout Japan depicted American soldiers as monsters with fangs and claws. Radio broadcasts described in graphic detail what happened to women in occupied territories. Military officers told female personnel that if capture was imminent, suicide was the only honorable option. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka, a 28-year-old former surgical nurse, had carried a cyanide capsule sewn into her uniform collar for 2 years. Now, sitting in the corner of the cramped barracks, she felt for it with trembling fingers. Around her, other women made similar preparations. Some had smuggled razor blades. Others had lengths of rope. A few whispered prayers to ancestors, asking forgiveness for what they were about to do. But Fumiko Nakamura did something different. She stood up, walked to the barracks door, and slid it open. The morning air was cool and smelled of salt water from the bay. Across the compound, American soldiers were gathering the male prisoners in formation. An officer with captain's bars on his collar was speaking through an interpreter, but his words were lost in the distance. Fumiko watched his gestures, the way he pointed toward the gates, then toward trucks parked outside the fence.
Behind her, someone hissed a warning. "Nakamura, get back inside. Don't let them see you." She didn't move. She had spent 3 years in this camp learning to read the difference between men who meant harm and men who simply carried weapons. The soldiers across the compound moved with purpose, but not aggression. Their rifles hung from shoulder straps, not pointed at anyone. The officer was smiling. It was the smile that made Fumiko decide to wait before using the poison tablet hidden in her own collar. To understand what was about to happen at Omori Camp, one must first understand the man who would shape American occupation policy toward Japanese prisoners, Colonel Frank Howley. though he was not present that day.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
His directives, issued in August 1945, were radical departures from how victorious armies traditionally behaved. The orders were simple but unprecedented. Japanese prisoners, including military personnel, were to be treated according to the Geneva Convention standards, even though Japan had not been a signatory. They would receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. And most importantly, General Douglas MacArthur's Direct Order No. 17 stated explicitly, American personnel will conduct themselves with dignity and respect toward all Japanese prisoners, regardless of rank, gender, or civilian status. The man who would enforce those orders at Omori was Captain James Mitchell, a 32-year-old Army officer from Iowa who had spent the war commanding supply logistics in the Pacific. He had never fired a shot in combat, but he had seen what happened when armies abandoned discipline. He had witnessed the aftermath of Japanese atrocities against Allied prisoners. He knew what revenge looked like. What he refused to accept was that America would become what it had fought against. On the morning of September 2nd, Mitchell stood outside the gates of Omori with 47 soldiers from the 1st Cavalry Division Support Battalion. They had been briefed on what to expect: hostile prisoners, possible suicide attempts, and the challenge of managing a population that had been conditioned to fear them. What Mitchell hadn't expected was the silence. When the gates opened and his men entered the compound, there was no shouting, no resistance, no movement at all. The male prisoners stood in ranks, eyes forward, waiting for whatever came next. The women's barracks remained shuttered and dark. Through the interpreter, Mitchell addressed the male prisoners first. His message was direct. The war is over. You are now under American military custody. You will be processed, documented, and released to civilian authorities within 72 hours. In the meantime, you will receive food, water, and medical attention. Does anyone require immediate medical care? The silence continued. Then, slowly, an elderly man raised his hand. He was limping, favoring his left leg. A medic moved forward immediately, helping him to a bench near the gate. Within minutes, the medic was cleaning an infected wound while other prisoners watched in stunned silence. This was not execution. This was not revenge. This was something they had not prepared for.
Mitchell turned toward the women's barracks. He could see faces pressed against the wooden slats, eyes wide with terror. He handed his rifle to the soldier beside him and walked forward alone, stopping 10 feet from the nearest building. "I am Captain James Mitchell, United States Army," he said in English, waiting for the interpreter to translate. "I know you've been told to fear us. I know what you've been ordered to believe, but I'm here to tell you something different." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You are prisoners of war, but you are also human beings. You will be treated as such. No one will harm you. No one will touch you without your permission. You will receive food, medical care, and transport to processing centers where you will be documented and released. This is not a trick. This is policy, and I will enforce it with every authority I have." The interpreter finished. Silence followed. Then the door to the nearest barracks slid open, and Fumiko Nakamura stepped out into the sunlight. She bowed deeply, formally, in the traditional Japanese manner. Then she straightened and spoke in clear but accented English. "Captain Mitchell, I am Corporal Fumiko Nakamura, Imperial Army Nurse Corps. I speak for the women here. We have been told many things about American soldiers. We have been told what will happen when you find us. Please understand, we are prepared to die rather than suffer dishonor." He looked at her, this small woman in a tattered uniform, standing between him and 346 terrified prisoners. He saw the resolve in her eyes and the poison capsule she held in her open palm. "Corporal Nakamura," he said quietly, "you won't need that.
I give you my word." She studied his face for a long moment. Then she looked back at the women watching from the darkness of the barracks, and she made a decision that would echo through the decades that followed. She closed her hand around the capsule, put it back in her collar, and said, "Then we will trust you, Captain. But if you break your word, we will know how to respond." Mitchell nodded once. Fair enough. What happened over the next 72 hours would become one of the most remarkable and least known stories of the Pacific War's end. It was a test of discipline against instinct, policy against prejudice, and humanity against the machinery of revenge. The first challenge came within hours. As American soldiers began distributing rations to the prisoners, several male guards who had been overseeing the camp tried to maintain control. They shouted orders at the Japanese prisoners, demanding they refuse American food, insisting that accepting it was a betrayal of the emperor. Mitchell handled it personally. He approached the senior Japanese guard, a sergeant, who was screaming at prisoners to return to their barracks. Through the interpreter, Mitchell gave him a choice: accept that the war was over and stand aside, or be restrained and removed.
The sergeant chose resistance. He lunged at Mitchell, reaching for the pistol on his hip. Two American soldiers tackled him before he made contact. They zip-tied his hands, sat him on the ground near the gate, and posted a guard. They did not strike him. They did not retaliate. They simply removed him from the equation. Fumiko watched this from the women's barracks doorway. She had expected violence in response to violence. Instead, she saw restraint. Professional, cold restraint. The second test came that evening. A young American private, no older than 20, was assigned to guard duty outside the women's barracks. He stood with his rifle at rest, scanning the compound. One of the younger Japanese women, barely 18, approached the doorway to empty a waste bucket. She was terrified, shaking so badly she nearly dropped the bucket. The private saw her struggling. He set his rifle against the wall, walked forward slowly with his hands visible, and took the bucket from her. He carried it to the waste pit, emptied it, rinsed it with water from a pump, and handed it back to her. Then he stepped back, picked up his rifle, and returned to his post. He said nothing. She said nothing. But Fumiko, watching from inside, saw something shift in the girl's eyes. Confusion, where there had been only terror. By the end of the first day, American medics had treated 23 prisoners for malnutrition, infected wounds, and dysentery. None of the patients were restrained during treatment, none were separated from witnesses. The medics worked in full view of other prisoners, explaining through interpreters what they were doing and why. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka, the former surgical nurse, watched an American corpsman stitch up an elderly woman's leg wound. He worked carefully, using proper sterile technique, administering local anesthetic before starting. The woman wept through the entire procedure, not from pain, but from disbelief. That night, Yuki approached Fumiko in the barracks. She held her own cyanide capsule in her palm. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why are they doing this?" Fumiko had no answer. She had been trained in military doctrine, battlefield medicine, and survival tactics. Nothing in her education had prepared her for mercy. The next morning, Captain Mitchell gathered the women in the compound's central yard. They came reluctantly, clustering together like a defensive formation. Mitchell stood on a wooden crate so everyone could see him clearly. "I want to explain what happens next," he said, waiting for translation. "In the next 48 hours, you will be transported to a civilian processing center in Yokohama. There you will be documented, given medical evaluations, and provided with civilian clothing if you choose to accept it. After processing, you will be released to return to your families or to civilian relocation centers if you have nowhere else to go." He paused, letting the interpreter catch up.
I want to be clear about something. Some of you are former military personnel. Some were imprisoned by your own government. None of that matters to us now. You are being released not as enemies, but as civilians caught in a war that has ended. What you do after release is your choice, but while you are under American custody, you will be treated with dignity. A voice called out from the crowd. It was an older woman, a former school teacher named Hanako Sato. She spoke in Japanese, and the interpreter translated, "Why should we believe you? We have heard what American soldiers do to prisoners." Mitchell looked directly at her. "Because if I wanted to hurt you, I would have done it already. You've been in our custody for 36 hours. Has anyone touched you? Has anyone threatened you? Has anyone denied you food or water?" Silence. "You've been lied to," Mitchell continued, "by your government, by propaganda, by officers who told you that surrender meant death or worse. They lied because they wanted you to fight to the last breath. But the war is over, and those lies end here." Another voice, younger this time. Fumiko recognized the girl who had been given help with the waste bucket. "What if we don't want to leave? What if we have nowhere to go?" Mitchell's expression softened slightly. "Then we'll help you find somewhere. There are relief organizations setting up across Japan. The Red Cross, civilian aid groups, religious organizations. You won't be abandoned." The questions continued for an hour. Some were practical, about food and transportation. Others were testing, probing for cracks in the promise. Mitchell answered every one, never losing patience, never showing frustration. When the meeting ended, the women returned to their barracks, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations started in whispers, debates formed. Some still clutched their hidden weapons, convinced the betrayal would come. Others, like Fumiko, began to consider the impossible, that these men actually meant what they said. That night, Fumiko couldn't sleep. She sat near the open barracks door, watching the American guards change shifts. They moved with military precision, saluting their officer, reporting in quiet voices. One guard pulled out a photograph and showed it to another, both men smiling at whatever memory it held. They were not monsters. They were just men, exhausted men who wanted to go home doing a job that required more discipline than anyone would ever recognize. She thought about the nurse she had been 3 years ago, treating wounded soldiers in a field hospital outside Manila. She remembered the faces of dying men, both Japanese and American, brought in from the battlefield. In their final moments, they all looked the same, scared, young, calling for their mothers. War had turned them into enemies. Peace, it seemed, was trying to turn them back into people. The next morning, trucks arrived to transport the prisoners to Yokohama. The women were loaded first, a decision Mitchell made deliberately to show trust. If he had meant them harm, he would have isolated them. Instead, he gave them priority. Fumiko was among the last to board. As she climbed into the truck, she turned to Captain Mitchell, who stood nearby with a clipboard checking names. "Captain," she said in English, "thank you for keeping your word." He looked up from his paperwork. "Corporal Nakamura, I'm sorry you were ever given reason to doubt it." The truck convoy rolled through the gates of Omori Camp at 0900 hours on September 4, 1945. Inside the covered trucks, 347 Japanese women sat in silence, watching the ruins of Tokyo pass by through the canvas flaps. Some still carried their hidden capsules and blades, others had quietly discarded them during the night. At the Yokohama Processing Center, they would be met by more American soldiers, Navy corpsmen, and civilian aid workers. They would be photographed, documented, and given medical examinations by female nurses specifically assigned for that purpose. They would receive new clothing, food rations, and letters of transit. And not one of them would be harmed. The story of what happened at Omori Camp spread slowly at first, whispered between former prisoners, shared cautiously with family members.
Many of the women never spoke of it publicly. The shame of having been imprisoned by their own government was too great. But those who did talk described the same thing. American soldiers who treated them not as spoils of war, but as human beings who deserved basic dignity. It was not mercy in the sense of pity. It was something more fundamental. The recognition that warfare did not erase humanity, and victory did not grant license for cruelty. Captain James Mitchell returned to Iowa in December 1945. He rarely spoke about his service in Japan, and when pressed, he would only say that he had done his duty. His personnel file contains a commendation for exemplary leadership in the treatment and processing of enemy prisoners of war, but the details remained classified for decades. Fumiko Nakamura was released from Yokohama processing on September 8, 1945. She returned to her family's home in Osaka to find it destroyed by firebombing. She worked for the next 3 years with the Japanese Red Cross, helping reunite displaced families. In 1952, she emigrated to the United States, settling in California, where she worked as a translator and advocate for Japanese war orphans. In a 1987 interview for an oral history project, she was asked what she remembered most about the end of the war. Her answer was simple. "I remember being taught to fear monsters and meeting men instead."
The convoy moved slowly through the devastated streets of Tokyo, following roads cleared of rubble by American engineers. Fumiko sat near the back of the lead truck, watching the city she barely recognized pass by. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash and twisted metal. Survivors picked through ruins, searching for anything salvageable. Children stood by the roadside, staring at the passing vehicles with hollow eyes. Beside her, Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka finally spoke after 2 hours of silence. "Do you think they're taking us somewhere to execute us all at once? Perhaps they need proper facilities." Fumiko didn't answer immediately. She was watching an American soldier in the truck cab ahead, visible through the canvas partition. He was reading a letter, his lips moving slightly as he mouthed the words. His expression was soft, almost tender. A man reading words from home. "No," Fumiko said finally. "I don't think so." "How can you be certain?" "Because men who plan to kill you don't waste medicine keeping you alive first." The Yokohama Processing Center had been established in a former Japanese naval training facility overlooking the harbor. When the trucks arrived, the women were directed to a large assembly hall where rows of tables had been set up. American personnel moved efficiently between stations, checking lists and organizing paperwork. But what caught everyone's attention were the women in white uniforms moving among the tables. American nurses, dozens of them. A Navy lieutenant commander, a woman in her 40s with gray streaking her dark hair, stepped forward to address the new arrivals. She spoke through an interpreter, her voice calm and professional. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Brennan. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for this facility. Over the next 48 hours, you'll go through a processing procedure that includes medical examination, documentation, and preparation for civilian release. I want to be absolutely clear about something. All medical examinations will be conducted by female medical personnel only. No male personnel will be present during examinations unless you specifically request a male doctor for a particular medical condition." She paused, making sure the interpreter finished. "You have the right to refuse any examination, though we strongly encourage you to accept medical care. Many of you are malnourished and may have untreated conditions. We're here to help, not to harm. If at any point you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, there are complaint officers stationed at every section of this facility. They speak Japanese and will address any concerns immediately." The women were divided into groups of 20 and led to different sections of the facility. Fumiko's group was taken to a barracks that had been converted into a temporary dormitory. The beds were clean, with fresh sheets and blankets. On each bed lay a small care package, soap, a towel, a comb, and a plain civilian dress. A young American nurse, barely older than some of the prisoners, demonstrated how to use the shower facilities. She spoke no Japanese, but her gestures were clear and patient. When one elderly woman began to cry, overwhelmed by simple kindness, the nurse produced a handkerchief and waited quietly until the woman composed herself. That evening, the medical examinations began. Fumiko was called to a private room where Lieutenant Commander Brennan waited with a Japanese-American nurse named Alice Yamada, who would serve as both interpreter and medical assistant. "Corporal Nakamura," Brennan said through Alice, "I see from your records that you were a surgical nurse. That means you'll understand what I'm looking for during this examination. I need to check for malnutrition, disease, injuries, and any conditions that require immediate treatment. May I proceed?" Fumiko nodded, then added in English, "I understand medical procedure. You may continue." Brennan's examination was thorough but respectful. She narrated every step, explaining what she was checking and why. When she discovered evidence of old injuries healed poorly, she asked about them. Fumiko explained, beatings from guards at Omori when she had spoken against continuing the war. Brennan documented everything without judgment, her medical notes clinical and precise. "You have significant scarring on your back and ribs. Some of these injuries didn't heal properly. You're likely experiencing chronic pain. I can prescribe medication and recommend physical therapy when you return to civilian life." Fumiko was silent for a moment. "Why do you care about pain that happened in the past?" Brennan looked at her directly. "Because pain doesn't stop being real just because time passes, and because you deserve medical care regardless of which uniform you wore." Over the next 2 days, similar scenes played out across the processing center. American medical personnel treated Japanese prisoners with a level of care that consistently surprised their patients. Infections were cleaned and bandaged. Broken bones that had healed incorrectly were documented for future treatment. Malnutrition cases received special dietary plans. Women suffering from trauma were offered counseling through Japanese-speaking therapists. The documentation process was equally methodical. Each woman was photographed, fingerprinted, and interviewed about her background, imprisonment, and family situation. The interviews were conducted by Japanese-American translators who had served in the military intelligence service. These men and women had their own complex feelings about the process. Many had family members who had been imprisoned in American internment camps while they fought for the United States. Corporal Daniel Tanaka, a Nisei soldier from California, interviewed Fumiko on her second day at the facility. He spoke Japanese fluently with a slight American accent that marked him as foreign-born. "I need to ask you some questions about your military service and your imprisonment. Some of these questions may be difficult. If you need to take breaks, just let me know." Fumiko studied him carefully. "You are Japanese, but you wear an American uniform." "Yes, my parents immigrated to California in 1920. I was born in Los Angeles." "And yet you fight for America, even though America imprisoned your people in camps?"
Tanaka was quiet for a moment. "Yes, that's true. My parents and younger sister spent 3 years in Manzanar. But I believed then, and I believe now, that America's ideals are worth fighting for, even when America fails to live up to them. Does that make sense?" "No," Fumiko said honestly, "but I respect it." The interview lasted 2 hours. Tanaka asked about her service in the Philippines, her medical training, the circumstances of her arrest by Japanese military police, and her time at Omori. He took detailed notes, but never pressed when she struggled to answer. When they finished, he handed her a document. "This is your release authorization. It's effective as of September 10, 1945. You're free to return to civilian life." There's a list of relief organizations on the back page that can help you find housing and employment. The Red Cross has a family reunification program if you need help locating relatives. Fumiko took the paper with both hands, staring at the official stamps and signatures. That's all? I just leave? That's all. You're a civilian now, Corporal Nakamura. The war is over. But for many women at the facility, the transition to freedom was complicated by a harsh reality. They had nowhere to go. Hanako Sato, the former school teacher who had questioned Captain Mitchell, discovered that her entire family had died in the Tokyo firebombing. Her home was gone, her school destroyed, and she was 54 years old with no savings and no prospects. Lieutenant Commander Brennan worked with the Red Cross to establish a temporary shelter program for displaced former prisoners. Within a week, a Buddhist temple in Kamakura had been converted into a women's shelter, staffed by Japanese volunteers and funded by American relief organizations. Hanako and 48 other women who had nowhere else to go were transported there, given stipends for basic necessities, and connected with job training programs. The youngest prisoner at Yokohama, 18-year-old Keiko Matsumoto, presented a different problem. She had been imprisoned at Omori because her father had been executed for espionage against the military government. She was terrified that her association with a traitor would make her unemployable in post-war Japan. An American chaplain, Father Michael O'Brien, worked with a Catholic orphanage in Nagasaki to find her a position as a teacher's assistant. The orphanage director, a Japanese nun named Sister Maria, agreed to take her in and train her. These individual interventions were happening across dozens of processing centers throughout Japan. American military personnel, often working with Japanese civilians and religious organizations, were creating an improvised social support system for former prisoners who had been abandoned by their own government. Major Robert Fitzgerald, the officer overseeing the entire processing operation in the Tokyo-Yokohama region, held daily briefings where he reviewed cases requiring special attention. His philosophy was pragmatic. We can't solve every problem, but we can make sure no one falls through the cracks into destitution or despair. Document everything, find resources, make connections. This is occupation work, gentlemen, and it's just as important as anything we did in combat.
The statistical results of this approach were remarkable. Of the 2,847 Japanese women processed through facilities in the Tokyo area during September 1945, 2,791 were successfully released to family members or civilian support organizations. The remaining 56 were elderly or medically fragile and were placed in nursing facilities or hospitals. Not one was left homeless or abandoned. The numbers told part of the story, but the human impact was harder to quantify. Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka, the former surgical nurse, was among those released to civilian life on September 11th. She returned to her family home in Kyoto to find her parents alive but struggling. The city had been spared the worst of the bombing, but food shortages were severe. 3 weeks after her release, she received an unexpected visitor, Alice Yamada, the Japanese-American nurse who had assisted with medical examinations at Yokohama. Alice was traveling through the region, helping to establish clinics in areas lacking medical infrastructure. "I remember you mentioned your surgical training," Alice said. "We're setting up a clinic here in Kyoto, and we desperately need experienced nurses. The pay is minimal, but it's steady work, and you'd be helping people who need it. Would you be interested?" Yuki stared at her. "You want me to work with Americans? After everything?" "I want you to work with patients who need medical care. The clinic is a joint operation. American funding and supplies, Japanese staff and administration. We're not trying to impose anything. We're just trying to help people survive until Japan can rebuild its own infrastructure." Yuki accepted the position. For the next 3 years, she worked at the Kyoto Medical Relief Clinic, treating civilians suffering from malnutrition, disease, and war injuries. She worked alongside 2 other Japanese nurses and 1 American doctor, a soft-spoken man from Minnesota who had served in field hospitals throughout the Pacific. They rarely discussed the war. They were too busy treating patients. In 1948, Yuki enrolled in an advanced medical training program sponsored by the occupation government. She studied modern surgical techniques and hospital administration. By 1952, she had become the director of nursing at Kyoto Municipal Hospital, overseeing a staff of 75 nurses and establishing training standards that would influence Japanese medical practice for decades. When asked in later years about the turning point in her life, she always cited the same moment. Standing in a room at Yokohama Processing Center, watching an American nurse treat her injuries with the same care she would give to one of her own people. I learned that professionalism transcends nationality, and that sometimes the people you're taught to fear are the ones who save you. The story of what happened at Omori and Yokohama spread slowly through post-war Japan. It was not the kind of story that occupied headlines. The nation was focused on reconstruction, food shortages, and the complex emotions of defeat. But among certain communities, particularly women who had suffered during the war, the story circulated quietly.
Fumiko Nakamura became an inadvertent witness to this process. After her release, she worked for the Japanese Red Cross's Family Reunification Program, helping displaced people locate missing relatives. The work brought her into contact with thousands of women who had survived the war in various states of trauma and displacement. Many had stories similar to hers: fear of American occupation forces, followed by surprised relief when the expected atrocities never materialized. A pattern emerged from these conversations. Women who had direct contact with American military personnel during the occupation's early months consistently reported being treated with more respect and dignity than they had expected. This stood in stark contrast to the propaganda they had been fed during the war. The Japanese government, under American Occupation Authority, was slowly acknowledging this reality. In January 1946, the Japanese Ministry of Health and Welfare issued a public statement encouraging women to cooperate with American medical programs and relief efforts. The statement included this carefully worded passage: "Initial reports indicate that American military personnel are conducting themselves in accordance with international standards of behavior. Women need not fear participating in relief programs." It was a remarkable admission from a government that had spent years telling its population that Americans were barbaric monsters. By 1947, systematic studies were beginning to emerge. Dr. Takeshi Yamamoto, a Japanese sociologist working with American occupation authorities, conducted surveys of over 5,000 Japanese women who had been imprisoned by their own government, or who had been in areas occupied by American forces during the war's final months. His findings were published in a report titled "Treatment of Japanese Female Prisoners and Civilians: A Comparative Analysis." The report's conclusions were striking. Japanese women who had been imprisoned by their own military government reported significantly higher rates of physical abuse, malnutrition, and denial of medical care compared to those who had been processed through American custody. The report noted, contrary to wartime propaganda, American military policy toward female prisoners adhered strictly to documented protocols emphasizing humane treatment and medical care. Instances of abuse by American personnel were statistically rare and, when reported, were subject to military discipline. The report was classified by occupation authorities, concerned it might complicate ongoing war crimes trials of Japanese military officials, but copies circulated among academic and policy circles, where it influenced thinking about post-war justice and reconstruction. Captain James Mitchell never knew about the report.
He had returned to Iowa, resumed his civilian career as an agricultural equipment manager, and rarely spoke about his military service. His wife knew he had served in Japan during the occupation, but he never discussed the details. It wasn't until 1963, when his daughter was studying World War II history in college, that she asked him directly what he had done in Japan.
He told her about Omori, about the women who had expected to die and had instead been given medical care and freedom, about the discipline it had required from his men to maintain professionalism in a situation designed to trigger revenge instincts, about how he had court-martialed 2 soldiers who had made inappropriate comments toward female prisoners, sending a clear message about what would and would not be tolerated. "We weren't heroes," he told his daughter. "We were just soldiers doing what we were supposed to do. But in that situation, doing what you're supposed to do felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done." His daughter asked why it was so hard. "Because we'd spent 3 years watching our friends die at the hands of an enemy who showed no mercy. We'd seen what they did to our prisoners, and then we were given authority over their people, and we had to choose what kind of men we wanted to be. Some of the guys wanted revenge. Hell, part of me wanted it too. But we had orders, and those orders were right, and we followed them. That's all." The story might have ended there, buried in personal memories and classified reports, except for one unexpected development. In 1975, a Japanese television network was producing a documentary series on the occupation period. A researcher discovered references to the Yokohama Processing Center in American military archives and began tracking down survivors. She found Fumiko Nakamura in Los Angeles, where she had lived since 1952. Fumiko was 54 years old, working as a translator and community advocate. At first, she declined to participate in the documentary. The memories were too complicated, too tied up with shame about her imprisonment and confusion about how to feel toward her former enemies. But the researcher was persistent. She explained that she wanted to tell the full story of the occupation, including the parts that didn't fit simple narratives of victors and vanquished. She had already interviewed several American veterans, including one of the medics who had served at Yokohama. They all told the same story: strict orders to treat prisoners humanely, and genuine effort to follow those orders. Fumiko finally agreed. The interview lasted 6 hours. She spoke about her fear, her certainty that she would die or worse, and her gradual realization that the Americans were following a code of conduct that her own military had abandoned. She spoke about Captain Mitchell's promise and how he had kept it. She spoke about Lieutenant Commander Brennan's medical care and the Japanese-American soldiers who had bridged 2 worlds to help both sides understand each other. The documentary aired in Japan in 1976 under the title Shattered Mirrors: The Occupation Experience. Fumiko's interview was featured prominently. The response was mixed. Some viewers praised her honesty. Others criticized her for speaking positively about occupation forces. But the documentary sparked a broader conversation about memory, propaganda, and the complicated truths of war.
In Iowa, a local newspaper ran a small article about the documentary, mentioning that a James Mitchell from Cedar Rapids had been identified as one of the American officers featured in archive footage. A reporter called Mitchell for comment. He was 63 years old, retired, and deeply uncomfortable with the attention. "I did my job," he told the reporter. "I followed orders that I believed were right. I don't need recognition for that. But if telling the story helps people understand that war doesn't have to destroy everything decent in us, then I guess it's worth telling." The reporter asked if he remembered any of the prisoners by name. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. "Corporal Nakamura," he said finally. "She was brave, braver than most of us. She stepped out of that barracks knowing we might kill her, and she did it anyway, because she thought it might protect the women behind her. I think about that sometimes. What kind of courage that took.